Good morning. Appreciate that everyone coming together today. While we sort of spun this as a webinar, it's not actually a webinar because we didn't open it up to the public. We really wanted to have it as a conversation between individuals within foundations as a new sort of space for us at Help Seeker. We understand from the work that we do, which we'll get into a little bit deeper with Jesse and I, the huge role that philanthropy plays within social change, and we really wanted to have a sort of frank, transparent conversation with those sector leaders within foundations to talk about the impact of social change and sort of the directions and things that we have seen and would love your opinion and support with. And we're doing this kind of work in different sectors such as chambers. We just did one yesterday with chambers, and it's just a way for us to sort of build some thought leadership space, bring people together, and really, as you'll learn, and hopefully those of you who know a little bit about Help Seeker, our goal is always to bring the pieces together, all the holistic pieces, knowing that there's so much work that everybody has to do to support our community members in all the places that we work, and foundations play a big role in that. So I think if we can pull up the deck, we can kickstart it off. And please know that this is also an informal, even though we have a deck, there are some slides. I think Jesse will just breeze through some of them really, and everyone will get a copy of the deck and information afterwards. But really we want it to be an open conversation between everybody here in the call. So please feel free to ask questions as we go, to speak up. There'll be many points of time for this really to be a conversation rather than just a speaking to.
Thank you. And so I'm just looking, we have far fewer than expected on this call based on the registrations, but I think that's okay. And with your respect to your time, I would love to open this up to the group, and panelists will still kind of lob questions at you, if you will. But I wanted to explain a little bit more on why we're in this room and why I hope it's the beginning of many conversations. So Help Seeker, if we could fast forward, Mo, I'll just do a brief introduction. Oh, forgive me. Oh, okay. Skip the land acknowledgement. That's not what we're doing. So I'm coming to you from Treaty 13 here in Toronto. We have people all across Turtle Island. I was actually in a really great meeting, and Mo, I believe it was your inspiration. Jen was saying that we're making a more intentional effort to tie our land acknowledgements to the actual work we're doing. And I'm so glad Chris is here and is able to talk some of the innovations they're doing around Indigenous-led funding. And I do think when we look at philanthropy and its ability to reinforce systems, inequitable systems, or free, and it advances us beyond those inequitable systems, I think there's incredible opportunity, and I hope we can bring that into the conversation today. Mo, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, just that again, that we are situated, sort of Calgary situated. Help Seeker was born out of Calgary, and so in the Mohkinstsis area of Treaty 7 territory, the Blackfoot, the Kainai, the Siksika, the Stoney Nakoda, as well as the Métis Nation Region 3. And just want to say that when we acknowledge land, it's so much deeper than just where we're working or where we're playing, or as guests. I know that the land acknowledgement piece is always something that has become sort of a table stakes, like that we should do. And I always I guess counsel my team and folks that go out when they're meeting with clients, no matter what, to take those moments to think about the land, to think about the connection to the First Peoples, because we know that within the social safety net sector, of which we work quite heavily in, there is a high proportion of Indigenous people that find themselves represented. And I know that in foundations, there are some that are very geared towards doing that work. So it's something that's not lost on us, that it's something of importance to keep in mind. So thank you.
Next. Well, I'm going to switch gears on why we're here, and then we'll bring it back to the panelists. So Help Seeker, we are a company dedicated to resolving complex social issues. We are agnostic when it comes to how. So we have a number of members on the team: economists, tech, development, product, data, social workers, communication specialists, and we really approach every social issue or every community we're in with a new lens and say, how can we make a measurable impact? We are in 2022 100% focused on performance-based, and when we say performance-based, that's creating social value, measurable social value, not just focused on deliverables, but actually making a difference and change in people's lives. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Perfect. What drives us, and actually why you're in the room. And I hope, like I said, for the beginning of multiple conversations. So we've mapped over almost close to 100,000 services and supports. If we could go back, please, in Canada. And we've also mapped hundreds of billions of dollars into the social safety net. So when we do something called financial flows audit, we do it in a geographic area or for an issue. You might have seen it. We formerly had done them with police, called social impact audit. And so in communities, we're tracing billions of dollars. So in Toronto alone, and I know this is recorded, but we've traced 23 billion into the social safety net annually. At the same time, we see repeated and increased calls for funding. And then we see worsening social issues and increasing human costs. So when we look at the money that's going into, especially municipalities, it's really interesting because the municipalities during COVID are receiving sort of increased, unprecedented public pressure to address social issues because of the visibility of homelessness and crime. But actually municipalities, well, many of them don't have a social mandate, but they have very little purchasing power within the social safety net. So we're looking at 2 to 8% is how much a municipality is putting into. When we look at who has the greatest social purchasing power for social issues, it's foundations and charities. So foundations have this incredible opportunity to change what infrastructure looks like, but foundations in many instances can be disconnected from these sort of municipal community integration efforts. So there's such an incredible opportunity for us to think as we reimagine how we build social infrastructure post-COVID, what's the role of the foundations and from a leadership standpoint and not just a money standpoint. And that's why we wanted to start to get people in the room saying there's a groundswell of something happening, new social investment models, and what role can foundations play and to what extent can foundations lead the charge. And the reason we have the panelists we have today, and I'm sure many of you who are participating as non-panelists, is we think these people are doing something sort of innovative and there's an opportunity to push the sector. Foundation purchasing. Thanks, Martin. When we look at the social, and I can share some of the data, when we look at the percentage of money going into a municipal social safety net, the foundations together compared to funding for community social services from the province is significant.
Maybe in your part of the world, not in ours.
That's fair. Martin, where are you based?
Edmonton.
Gotcha. Okay, awesome.
Yeah. I'd say that's also certainly true in Ottawa. I mean, even though the social services budget of the municipality is a relatively very small proportion of its overall spending and has grown very little, it is still a very significant compared to, the amount of granting that we do. But I mean, I'm not sure how we're using terms here as well, because social purchasing power, has perhaps a different connotation depending on what lens you're using on it.
And Mo, go ahead, Martin, please. Yeah, jump in.
I certainly agree with the observation about the modesty of municipal resources toward this file, but provincial government in our part of the world is the very highest, and federal government is somewhere in there. Municipalities are the lowest level of government in terms of investment here, but all of those are larger than not just foundations, but all of philanthropy. So I don't understand, but anyway, it's certainly true that municipalities experience the social issues most deeply, and they have the fewest resources to deal with them. So
Awesome.
that part I quite agree with.
Awesome. Thank you, Martin. I appreciate that. Thanks. So next slide here. Let's jump in. Let's jump into the panelists. Let's introduce everyone. Mo, do you want to lead that part? And then we'll get to the questions. And thank you for jumping in. Please continue to, because I would really like to have a robust kind of conversation.
Wonderful. Yes, thanks. So we are very fortunate to have 4 panelists with us today who have really sort of worked with us, quite quickly to put this together and lead some direction in terms of giving us some thoughts and thought-provoking points based on what they are doing. And so we really appreciate your time here and your leadership in showing up today with us. So first, we'll just go through and have everybody introduce themselves, in maybe a 2-minute sort of a pitch of who you are, where you're from, and what your work is, and maybe just a little bit on like why you answered the call to come to this conversation today. I'll start with Atif from North Pine Foundation.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Yeah, my name is Atif Baskandri. I'm the CEO of the North Pine Foundation. A bit of my background, it's a pretty mixed academic career background between electrical engineering and designing Black-based smartphones when Black-based smartphones were still a thing, to then diving into more of a social justice lens. And now innovation in a bunch of different sectors. Outside of North Pine, my wife and I have a social enterprise focused on anti-racism education based off of a documentary film that we made about my life growing up as a brown Muslim in rural Newfoundland. So that's a bit about me, and really looking forward to the conversation.
Perfect, thank you. And why did you take up the call to come have this conversation with us today?
I am really new to the capital P philanthropy sector. I come from a lot of different sectors. This is kind of 1 year in. So it's been an interesting exploration for me. I love meeting new people and getting a sense of new ideas and also old ideas and what's been happening.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And next we'll introduce Chris Archie from The Circle. Welcome.
Good morning. Wait, no, wait. Hello, everyone. Chris Archie runs Quest, Aquatum de Gelmo from Tieskin. My name is Chris Archie. My home community is Tieskin, which is known as Broken Rock and in the central interior of British Columbia. I'm super fortunate to have an unbroken tie to my home community where my ancestors have walked since the beginning of time. My father's a 4th-generation settler Canadian, and like many Canadians who immigrated to Canada and settled in the prairies, they were given the gift of stolen land and built intergenerational wealth through farming and ranching. I am the CEO for the Circle on Philanthropy. We are a national member-based organization, and our work is really about the redistribution of wealth from what we call settler philanthropy to Indigenous-led charitable grassroots and Indigenous communities throughout this country. And we do that through a range of both technical and relational skill building, both separate and together with our member audiences. And I took this call because I'm known to be insatiably curious. I love to ask questions. I love to be asked questions. And so I was just really interested in this conversation. So thanks for having me. Kukshim.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. Mona Hunter Family Foundation, you're next.
Hi, I'm so glad to be on the call this morning. I'm Mona Hunter. I'm with the Hunter Family Foundation. I believe foundations really can play a huge role in changing how we approach really complex social problems. We currently have gone through a transformation in our foundation in the last sort of 7 years, where it became sort of a focused foundation on kind of 3 platforms that we look at investing in. And so through that whole process, we're now going down the road of doing some work in the mental health space. It's been such an incredible experience to be able to collaborate with not only other foundations, but other service industries in that space, and also entrepreneurs, technologists. I just feel really strongly about the work that Help Seeker is doing as well, and I'm looking forward to the conversation about this. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Mona. Paul.
Perfect.
Full disclosure, Paul is my mentor and former boss, but lifelong mentor. So thank you for joining, Paul.
Well, thanks, Jesse. I learned as much from you and from everyone else here. It's just such a joy to be a part of this, be invited to join this important conversation. I come to the conversation with a few different hats on, I suppose. One is through work of our organization called Impact, which is a B Corp with a mission of helping corporations to benefit from solving social problems, which is easier said than done. But our work is really centered around shifting how corporations address social issues from what I would call sort of CSR light to actually doing something that's meaningful and measurable. And also, a couple of years ago, we started our own foundation called the Impact Foundation for Social Change, which I'm the chair of the board of, and that's a foundation which exists to create pathways to employment for vulnerable people, with a particular emphasis currently on newcomers and refugees to Canada. So kind of have they both advising other folks about how to have more impact and then doing it directly ourselves. So it's a pleasure to be here and to be learning from all of you.
Amazing. Thank you, everybody. I think that we have a couple of questions that we put together based on our conversations, and I think we'll probably flow in a couple of those, and I think that there'll be some that'll be generated just naturally out of a way of conversation. And please note that while we're asking these of the panelists, given the intimate nature of this call today, feel free for anybody to jump in, ask questions, or ask for clarifications as well. We hope that this is a safe space to do so and offer that open to you guys. I think I wanted to sort of pick up a little bit on what you said there, Paul, in terms of meaningful and measurable and impact. And I think one of the things that we have been working towards a lot at Help Seeker is, knowing that we work with many municipalities, communities, organizations, and the question we always ask ourselves is, are we creating value and impact when we come into a community and support? And how do we know that we're doing that? And how are we measuring? And what metrics are we using? And we're constantly, I think it's a constant change and follow through based in the systems that we work within, in terms of how do we do that? What is the sort of best and promising practice at this time? And we're always looking to do better in that and to be able to report that out to community. Knowing that my experience, and I'm only coming from one space of working with different funders within the Indigenous space, sometimes there are some foundations where it seems that there is no real measurable metrics, and money is given out and they don't really care how it's spent or what it's done, as long as they have sort of a PR, yes, we gave this money to that or this money to that. And I don't know if that's just in the Indigenous space and that's all, I'm most knowledgeable about, or if that's across the field. But is performance management a dirty word in philanthropy? Do you guys really believe and think about measuring outcomes and impact is something that you do really well, or you need to do more of, or thoughts on that? Leaving it open. Yeah.
Do you mind if let's unshare the screen and we can see everyone's faces?
Yeah.
At the meeting. That would be great. Sorry to interrupt. Okay, I love that question though. Is performance management a dirty word in philanthropy? How do you think about measuring outcomes and impact?
I'm happy to kick us off. As someone who works in an organization that's philanthropic adjacent, I would say that the only dirty thing about performance management is that I think it means one thing to the philanthropic sector and another to community organizations and social serving organizations. Having worked for a community foundation for many years, what I know about as a grant maker in that period, what I know about grant making in the community foundation space is there's a lot of information that's collected and gathered from grantee organizations, many of which are focused on a particular strategy or a particular funding stream. And to be honest, and maybe this is the bigger dirty secret, many foundations are not doing enough to understand the data they're collecting. They're not doing enough to make sense of what they're hearing, and they're not doing enough to make that wisdom that they're gathering from grantees available back to the broader community to do sense making. Many times we see that sense making about what they're hearing from the grantee perspective is happening in-house at foundations that are predominantly not at all representative of the communities they seek to serve through their grant making. I myself, as a CEO with a growing team, I think performance management is not only a responsibility, it's an ethical responsibility to building strong leaders in a nonprofit sector, especially all of my staff are Indigenous and are racialized women. I have a deep commitment to that, but I think it's important to think about, like, at what point does a philanthropic institution feel like it has the right or more wisdom to be leading in performance management for an organization that may have decades of good thinking and relationships in the work that they're undertaking.
So just build on that, I appreciate what you said. And I think that so much of it has to do with a perspective, like who's assessing performance, and very most commonly, it's not the right perspective. Say, so what the metrics are. So I feel it's one of those questions like I would say yes and no. Like measuring performance is good depending on the perspective. I also think that there's become sometimes measuring performance can be a barrier to actually taking action, getting money out and getting stuff done. And I've seen that too. So I think it depends. It's one of those, things. So obviously at a certain level, one would want to understand the value of the capital you're applying to social change and the degree to which that's contributing to actual, as I said, meaningful and measurable change, as long as it doesn't get in the way of actually doing stuff and acting quickly, which I think is really important too.
So I'll step in a little bit on this. So as a foundation, we have different levels of investment into the community, and the larger the investment, the more careful we are with the people we're investing into, or the services we're investing into, to ensure that there are some measurables and that the money we're putting into these areas actually is changing people's lives, is doing the good work that it's supposed to do. I'll give you an example. We've invested into entrepreneurship quite heavily over the years. U of C being one of them, creating an entrepreneurship hub, or the Hunter Hub, Hunter Center. And we do measure whether or not that's had an impact in creating entrepreneurs, creating more jobs, creating more, better lives for people, I guess, in specifically more of the Alberta content. We also don't just want to measure that in terms of jobs. We want to make sure that, the entrepreneurship is being invested in businesses that create jobs in areas that have high growth, right, too, as well. So that's important to us. We're doing some work in mental health as well, and we're wanting to make a big investment on that. And we do have sort of pillars, or we've set goals into the Mental Health Service and Innovation Center that we've started as to what it can change in that space from the standpoint of improving services to people, getting people to the right services at the right time. Are we actually going to make a difference in that area, which is really important? So from a philanthropist standpoint, I think it's really important to be able to have some measurement or some feedback back to whether or not your investment into organizations and grantees actually are doing the things that you want them to do, or not that you want them to do, but that you're hoping are changing the people's lives that they're working with. So.
And I guess I'll go in on my background, working in a bunch of different sectors, most recently working with entrepreneurs and venture capital. I found something interesting where you'd hear this language in the private sector startup community where everyone talks about being customer obsessed. And I say that they don't necessarily say that out of good intentions, but it's because if the people you say you're serving don't actually get value out of what it is that you're doing, you fail as a startup. If they get that value, you succeed. And investors in that startup will succeed if you create value for your end user, and they will fail if you don't create value for your end user. So I remember coming into philanthropy, the first question I asked myself is, what is my pathway to failure? And it's actually a question I ask in every interview for everyone that I've hired into the job. It's, how do you create a system that gets me fired from this job if we're not actually creating value for the people that we say that we're serving? And in essence, when we talk about performance management, I think a lot about performance management of us internally as a team. What is the value that we add to any kind of the service or whatever it is that we're trying to provide? And I use end users because I come from the tech background, but like the people that we say that we're serving, what's the value we provide? And one thing when we think about performance management is actually coming off of Chris's point about the social purpose organizations working that are more closer to the end user. A small anecdote is one of the first organizations that we recently funded, actually. In part of our due diligence and relationship building, we're having this conversation about this movement we wanted to work on together. And we came to this moment where it became a we conversation. How are we going to work together to make this change happen? And as soon as we said the word metrics, it turned into an us and them conversation. And I would say they turned it into an us and them conversation, because they're like, oh, like, tell us what metrics you want. We know some funders like this, this, and this. And we stopped them midway and we said, hold on a second. We don't have metrics. Don't worry about our metrics. You tell us what are the metrics you need to better serve your end user. And what do you need to figure out that can let you operate in an excellent way? And then that is basically going to be our ability of sense making of what is good performance measurement that's closer to the end user. Because at the end, like, we are more disconnected from that end user. We probably come up with pretty poor metrics. So how is it that we let them design it, help inform us, and how do we then understand from where we're standing in a different view of how to apply that elsewhere to scale out or amplify the work that they're doing. So that's been our approach to performance management. I would say the jury's still out on like the kind of value we're creating. We're just getting started, but that's been our take on it.
Rebecca, I see your hand there.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, such an interesting conversation. I mean, this is an absolutely huge topic, as we all know. And when we talk about performance measurement, again, you know, what do the words mean? I really like what you were just saying, Atif. You know, that in a sense, we have to understand as funders what our own performance is, as much as we need to understand what the performance of the organizations that we fund are. What is our performance in relation to supporting systems level shifts, you know, towards more profound solutions and outcomes. But, you know, like you track the, you know, the activities to the impacts to the outcomes in a very, you know, in a very formalized sort of evaluation system. This is what people's minds often go to. And I think for a lot of the organizations that we fund, which are very small, it would be ridiculous to expect them to be able to evaluate the outcomes of the work that they do. This is work that we need to do collectively, and it's as much wisdom seeking and wisdom creating as it is data and analysis oriented. And I think part of the problem when we talk about performance measurement is we think in terms of that adage, which actually drives me a little bit up the wall: what gets measured gets managed, because how that often translates is we measure what is simple to measure, and we end up focusing on downstream solutions because the upstream stuff is much harder to address and to measure. So, you know, I think if we're going to talk about what our roles and responsibilities are as funders with respect to outcomes, then the idea of being able to somehow collaborate to look at a higher level at how to understand how activities track through to outcomes, so that we take the burden off individual organizations to figure out what that trajectory is. And just taking a really sort of simple example of that, of literacy, which has actually been massively defunded in a lot of ways over the last 10 years. It was a very popular, sort of funding area up until about 10 years ago. But, there has been some research done by universities that tracks the benefits of early literacy through to longer term outcomes in terms of employment and so on. So that's a really important research, because again, we don't want to put the burden on individual literacy organizations to tell us what the longer term outcomes and benefits are. If we know that certain activities deliver certain kinds of outcomes because we've invested in the broader research to prove that, then it simplifies our job. I mean, we know that what we can do is invest in really good literacy programs in early education to create that foundation. So anyway, a bunch of thoughts there, and I'm really appreciating what everybody else is contributing.
Do you mind if I jump off on a comment that Chris put in the chat on how, talking about like pretty much like healthy organizations, healthy staff. And that's kind of like one of the unfortunate things that I see, wherein when we talk about performance management, I find a lot of the gold stuff in that performance management piece actually lies in so-called the operations and admin side of organizations, not necessarily on the programming side. So ironically enough and tragically enough, when you have organizations that are closest with working with some of the most marginalized and vulnerable end users that have the most restrictive business models that they have to navigate, and you find many organizations that have to do many things for many people because that's just how they operate, yet they don't have the ability to build out that healthy organizational model. You might be able to measure performance of a single project, but then it kind of dies off there. It's not, when you talk about sustainability. I remember my colleagues, one of my colleagues who comes from a deep background of working with refugees, every time I talk about sustainability in the charity space, she laughs at me, or scalability, just about how difficult it is. And I think that's one of the things where there's a big opportunity, because like we've seen charities that will have 13 different programs running just so they can get enough operational funding to support what it is that they're doing. So our approach has been to like offer just unrestricted funding for everything, like any organization that we work with, but then to also work very closely with that organization to help build up that capacity.
I want to thank you for adding to that, Atif, because I think there is a lot of energy around supporting entrepreneurs, and there is this insistence on grind culture. I was an entrepreneur for many years. I have a naturally entrepreneurial spirit, but I also recognize how potentially harmful that is for me, for my family, for the people who have to work alongside me, because there's this grind culture that actually puts my health and well-being secondary. It means that I'm not thinking wisely about RSPs and pension and health and wellness benefits. And so I often see entrepreneurial programs will say, like, build communication strategies, talk about savings, but not going that extra step to say, how do we talk about health and well-being? How do we ensure mental health is considered? How do we ensure that family relationships aren't put secondary to the entrepreneurial drive of an individual? How do we actually use entrepreneurial programs as an opportunity to build wealth and to redistribute wealth and to increase the well-being of folks who are working in business, so that that actual practice of building wealth and then hopefully creating intergenerational wealth doesn't come at the cost of lost relationships and a lack of pension supports and RSP investments from the startup. So I think that similarly to organizations broadly, so many of our members are Indigenous-led organizations. Their funding dollars are project-based. And so when the philanthropic sector, only provides project-based funding, it's undermining the organizational infrastructure that is required to do quality work. And so it's not helped by organizations in the charitable sector who like to talk about, how many pennies per dollar are going to administration and how that's a bad thing. That's a really unhelpful project that happens. We need to actually get back to honoring people need to be paid well. They need to have benefits. They need healthy workplaces that they can feel welcomed in to show up in. And they need to be able to live their lives as well. And so often what we see in Indigenous organizations is they're having to hollow out their administration and operations in order to keep delivering on programs that are very important for them. And they're not doing enough to be supported in general operating dollars. So, and yeah, thank you, Martin. Again, I think that governments also need to take the lead on this. They're like some of the worst. Municipal government funders, often only project-based, very time limited. And then federal government, I mean,
Even worse.
Started there, but they're even worse. I mean, they're like, yes, here's a grant. You have to spend out a third of the grant before you get your first payment. Oh, and if you're not an organization big enough to have the credit to pull that kind of money to run the program, then they just decide they're not going to pay you the money. So yes, there are lots of ways that both municipal, federal government, and philanthropy could be working better together to support organizations.
Thank you, Chris.
So,
Sorry, go ahead.
so we're a foundation that actually has 3 pillars, and one of them is entrepreneurship, and one of them is free market thinking, and the third one is health, and specifically healthy societies, mental health, physical health, but we're ebbed into mental health as our third pillar. I think when we talk about entrepreneurship, we don't necessarily talk about just creating business. We talk about entrepreneur thinking, the mindset of entrepreneurs, innovation, bringing existing solutions and applying them in different ways to new current problems and those kind of things. So it's not just about sort of creating more businesses. Of course, that's important, obviously, because business generates revenue, tax revenue, and all sorts of revenues that can go back into supporting social systems. But we do realize and do look at mental health as a really significant portion of our funding, because we understand that in order to have a society that's healthy or a good ecosystem for entrepreneurship and innovation, we need to have a healthy society full of people that, are fulfilling their dreams, that are, mentally and physically healthy as well. So that's why our third pillar is mental health, and entrepreneurial thinking. We promote that but through U of C, and also working with organizations like Momentum, Evolve U, Windmill, that provide funding and support to people to get people to work and doing the things they want to do and love, right? So it's just interesting that way that your comment sort of, you do have to have an acknowledgement of health in society in order, to be all encompassing and have a good ecosystem for entrepreneurship and innovation too as well.
Mm-hmm.
Just taking it back. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Just taking it back to the sort of performance measurement question again, from that question of mental health and mental health investment. This is obviously, we are collectively facing a massive epidemic of mental health, mental illness. Again, thinking about it in terms of a performance measurement framework, we can invest a lot in counseling services, which is a professionalized way of dealing with the issue of mental illness, and absolutely has a role, and is the sort of easier to measure again end of things. How have people done through counseling to address their mental illness? But I think the space that we're probably all seeing a lot of hope in relates more to building capacity in community through peer supports, through mental health first aid and that kind of stuff, and through actually just creating the conditions where people feel a sense of agency and well-being from the get-go, so don't fall into mental. But again, that's, those are all things that are intuitively really appealing, but very, very difficult to evaluate, because in a sense they address the problems before the problems become problems. And it's much easier to measure how we resolve problems than how we prevent problems.
Thank you, Rebecca. Paul, did you want to jump in? And then I have a question for the group, a new question for the group.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just listening to everybody. I think that there's some I agree with everything. It's an interesting conversation. There's no real right answer here. I think that one of the sort of paradox that I see a lot of is in terms of performance measurement, is the organizations that are probably most where it would be easiest to measure performance are often the ones that are least innovative. You know, institutionalized organizations, you know, that follow a standard set of, you know, kind of commonly accepted, you know, internal and external performance measures. It's not wrong, but, you know, sometimes those are the organizations that we can't depend on to get the kind of social change results that we actually need. It's the more innovative, smaller organizations that are doing cool stuff that are harder to assess.
Thanks. I'm actually going to bring up a meeting, Paul, you and I were in. We won't name who. We had a meeting years ago now with a fairly forward-thinking company, claimed to be forward-thinking, and they wanted to build a youth program. It was a corporate foundation, wanted to build a youth program specifically around employment, I think. And so they had several organizations, top organizations, come in and present to them. And Paul and I were in the room, and we were thinking, presentation went great. And at the end of the presentation, one of the women looked up and said, "So that's $50 a head, right?" And we went, "What?" And she said, $50 a head, youth, that's how much it's going to cost us. And we were sort of taken aback. So at that time, and corporate philanthropy and funding philanthropy, not so different, is because that was in part how performance of a funder was measured. How many people are you impacting for the money you're putting out? And we're seeing, of course, that shift towards many of the things you're talking about. So based on, Rebecca, you had said something about the performance of a funder, but is the definition of good performance for funders and foundations changing? And where is that going? And what are the expectations within foundations for quote unquote performance?
It's interesting because one of the big challenges that we're having right now in North Pine, it's for, and I think it is, from what I'm hearing, a shift in how performance of philanthropy is. So of the $92 billion that philanthropy foundations in Canada manage annually, $7 billion is deployed into grants, and the other $85 billion is invested with the primary goal of getting a financial return on investment to ultimately enable grant making. And yeah, I understand that purpose of that business model. But one of the questions that we're trying to figure out right now for North Pine, because we're in the position that how is it that 100% of the capital that flows through our organization is actually directly related to the impact for the people that we say that we're serving? And we are very focused on our populations. So like our populations, some might call them niche areas. We actually think there's a lot of depth there. For example, formerly incarcerated people within a few years of exiting the prison system is one of our focus areas. And when we look at the so-called investable assets that we could invest in that space, nothing really there, not a whole lot. We might have to go build it. That is if we kind of look at the open market. That being said, social welfare in Canada is already heavily financialized because we spend $80,000 to $150,000 annually imprisoning people, and it costs, and we have a reoffense rate in Canada of probably over 30%. And the average annual employment income of people exiting prison in Canada 14 years after exiting is $14,000 annually. So there's actually a lot of money that's flying into this thing. Like, it's not like there's no money. It's not like there's no pool of capital out there. But how is it that we actually engage with that? That's actually the tricky piece for us. If we rely on the open market, that they don't have access to those finances. That's primarily held in how government spends, how public sector spends. Then we talk about how public sector changes how it spends to get better quality performance for people who can actually go through a transformative justice experience rather than punitive. So those are some of like the many challenges that we're dealing with internally of how we navigate inside of this to basically deploy the capital that we have.
So we've tried as a foundation to actually, I'll give you an example, the mental health area that we're ebbing into. we sat down and we wanted to make a significant investment into that area, but we also really wanted to understand that space better. So unless you understand the space you're investing in initially, it's really hard to measure whether you're making an impact on that space, right? If you don't know where you're coming from, you don't know where you're going to go, right? So we spent a significant amount of funds studying sort of the emerging adult space in Calgary and surrounding area to really get an understanding as to what was really happening in that space. So we managed to pull together a group of service providers that typically didn't really communicate very well together, spent a lot of time building trust between those providers, and then it launched into a significant research project. For us as it was meant for us as a funder to really better understand what was actually really happening in that space. And through that document and through that research, we were able to sort of identify some gaps and some areas that we could ebb into, including the area of actually being a collaborator, of actually being able to pull together people to work better in that space. So it's been such an incredible journey because we had a sense of where we were. We actually did the work ahead of time, research as to what really does that system look like? What does that space look like? And then we could set some targets as to how do we want to change that space? How do we want to invest in that space in hopes that we actually make a difference in that space? So I think for us, it was the initial understanding of what space we wanted to be into, why we wanted to be into it, and then we could set some targets as to what we expect it to do in that space and how to change that space. And now we're working on that second phase. And we've created an organization of sort of 50 organizations from actually across Canada looking at the mental health space. And those organizations aren't just service providers. They're people that have lived experience. There's organizations like Platform Calgary that come from an innovation standpoint. There's Help Seeker that is data-driven that we plan to use for another research project to again understand that space even better. So for us, it's important that things are a bit data-driven and that we understand where we're going in order to, see what changes we do want to make from a system standpoint. So just a comment
Thanks, Mona.
on how we've approached it.
Thank you. Any other panelists? What does good funder performance look like over the next 5-10 years?
Oh, I was trying to hold back because I certainly have a lot of views here. In the work that we're doing, we're working to invite settler philanthropic actors in the space to think and do their work differently. What we know based on actual practice is that there are many philanthropic organizations who break their own rules in order to fund and support creative, unique, and innovative projects in their communities. And they do this by creating service agreements, contracts, all kinds of creative ways that it happens. CRA knows that this happens. All the folks who do it, they know that they're doing it. But what's really needed is some change to the Income Tax Act to just acknowledge that there are these problematic limitations on actually just supporting good work. So I think what we're going to see, what I hope to see more and more is settler philanthropic organizations using their social capital as well as their financial capital and their access to folks in a variety of positions of power to start mobilizing their social capital to create change that benefits organizations and not focuses on serving their, reduced annual grant making. So one of the big conversations in this last year was like, well, the annual disbursement quota is 3.5%. Some people think it should be 5%. Some people think it should be 10%. And there was all of this noise and all of this, like, which side are you on? Are you for increased DQ? Do you want to keep it as it is? And the whole time that was happening, I was sitting back going, this is not even the conversation that matters. Because for our communities, for the organizations we support, they receive less than 1% of philanthropic dollars in this country go to Indigenous organizations. Now, it is an even smaller amount of money that goes to Indigenous-led organizations, because predominantly the funding that goes from philanthropic organizations for Indigenous things or people or programs actually go to what we would call settler-led organizations, or those that believe that they're benefiting Indigenous people. That's hugely problematic for a range of reasons. So what I'm hoping is that we see more and more settler philanthropic institutions also recognizing that they have the ability to build out data sets and questions that help them and their grant adjudicators make wiser decisions about who they're funding and for what purpose. I do believe that there's a slide that was shared for a tool that we created, we call the I4DM. And so I'd just love if we could just put that up really quickly. So this is based on a bit of work from many years ago, where we did a CRA data scrape to understand what level of funding went to Indigenous organizations. That's when we discovered about 1% of philanthropic dollars goes to Indigenous organizations. Oh, sorry, I'm just distracted by this screen. Let me just move that over. So we discovered that less than 1% of Indigenous organizations receive dollars, but with an Indigenous community advisor, they actually recognize, a team of Indigenous advisors recognize that of that data scrape, many of them were large institutional organizations and community organizations that actually were not Indigenous led. Many didn't even have Indigenous people on their board or in their leadership or actually, running the programs. So we'll get the actual slide up, and not the
Chris,
desktop.
while you're doing that, just a quick note around the whole CRA thing in relation to foundations' abilities to fund organizations that do not have charitable status. I think one of the things that we can try to collectively do as funders is push that envelope within our own granting. And we try to do that at the Ottawa Community Foundation by really encouraging charitable partnerships. And we recognize that there are, in a sense, potential risks to the charitable organizations that do those partnerships. But, and we try to be really honest about that. But I think we really need to encourage charitable organizations to do those kinds of partnerships and be ready to go to bat if there are challenges that arise from CRA based on current regs around that. So, the more organizations that do this and the more that it becomes accepted practice, the more difficult it will be to, kind of use the bludgeon of existing constraints to limit those opportunities. So
Yeah, and
put a plug
connected
in.
to that, I would just add that if folks aren't aware of Bill S-216, which was brought to the Senate by Senator Ratna Omidvar, then please take a look at that. That is a change that she is bringing forward to the Income Tax Act that actually, it would in many ways make moot the qualified donee status category, which would be incredibly helpful for a range of Indigenous communities and organizations who wouldn't have to, build a case to purport that they behave like a municipality if in fact they are a nation. And so I think it's really important to understand that it is now in Parliament. As I understand, it's gone, I think, through its second reading. So it would be good for folks to know about that. We have some stuff on our website, and we're advocating that our members, both Indigenous organizations and settler philanthropic organizations, learn more about the issue and advocate on behalf of it, because who stands to benefit the most? It's Indigenous, Black, and other racialized and equity-seeking communities who are going to benefit most from that change. So thank you. So this, the I4DM is a definitional matrix that we hope helps settler philanthropic groups and or community organizations and others understand the difference between the kinds of work that's happening alongside Indigenous organizations. So it's a bit of a spectrum here. And of course, we would love for all kinds of things to be Indigenous led, but there's all kinds of very important, legitimate reasons why that's not the case. But we do want to just be able to give folks a tool so that they can understand the spectrum, and most importantly, be honest about where they are on it. Are you funding Indigenous partnerships, or are you actually only funding Indigenous benefiting organizations? So along the top, you see the 4 different categories: Indigenous benefiting, informed partnerships, and Indigenous led work. On the left, we've given a few primers that demonstrate that actually what we're talking about are very specific metrics in some ways. What does the leadership look like at the organization? What are the values and the protocols? What does the program and team look like? And what is their accountability to community, if any at all? And then last but not least, we use the language of reciprocity. Is there actually a relationship of reciprocity versus transaction? It's okay that the philanthropic sector can be very transactional. We just don't want people to pretend that they're being transformational when it's a transaction. And so that's why we use some of that language. And I shared this with you as well as the next page. It's a 3-page document. Is that we as an organization will say to people all the time, we have more questions than we have answers. And we like to invite our members to build a reflective capacity and to be more curious in the work, less knowers and more, questioners and learners. And these are questions to explore. And so if you're looking at grants, if you've got grant adjudicators trying to make a decision about who to fund, this could be hopefully a really helpful resource and tool for them that I just wanted to share with folks.
And Chris, we have your permission to share that with this group following this conversation, right? Awesome.
Yep, it's a public document now. We launched
Love
it
it.
a few
Thanks
weeks
for sharing
ago.
that. It was really great.
It's really helpful because we have all kinds of organizations who approach us and say they want to support Indigenous organizations, and they do their Google search, and lo and behold, what comes up? United Way, Boys and Girls Clubs, YWCAs. It's the big folks, right? And that's fine. They've got the communications budget. They've got the donor development staff and team. The reality is that many of the organizations who could seek to benefit from these kinds of investments by a lot of corporate CSR groups are not the big guns. They're not the ones who have the website domains and all of the SEO sorted out to be at the top of the Google search. So often we work with groups like, we did some fantastic work with Lululemon, who approached us and said, we want to do some grant making in Canada. We have no relationships to Indigenous communities. How might we do that? And we're like, well, you're kind of a Vancouver-based brand. That's where you built your empire. What's your relationship to the host nations in and around Vancouver, to the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh? And they were like, yeah, we don't have one. Great, let's start there. So they actually gave a financial gift to each of those nations. We helped broker and facilitate a relationship directly to the leadership of those communities. They received $250,000 each of those communities. It was just here's the money. In many ways, it was accepted and acknowledged as a reparations payment. It's like, we built this empire here. We have no relationship to you. We might want to build one down the road, but in the meantime, here's some money. It's the least we can do. They now are in their second year of building relationships to those host nations. Don't be surprised if you start to see amazing Indigenous inspired Lululemon work. If you ever go into their stores, you'll see increasingly more and more Indigenous art in their spaces as they acknowledge the land and the territories where they are. And as they continue to build this internal capacity at their corporation, they will work with Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people to educate their entire global team about where this company started. So there are lots of ways, thinking back again around procurement and social capital. This is one of the ways that folks can think and do their work differently, is just by one conversation and saying, yeah, you can fund these things that can make a lot of noise and tell you that they're serving soup to Native kids in some remote community. But can you give the money directly to the nation and let them decide what they want to do with it? Because that's the way that we think that the settler philanthropic sector can improve over the next few years. Give the money directly to communities. They know best what to do with it, and then get out of their way. Get out of the way, let them do their good work. And I think that would be really helpful to see more of.
I love that. And that's the measure of performance, that what you just said has been done. And that's all you need to do, sometimes. I would just build on what you just said, because our, perspective, a lot of it is working with large corporations. And sadly, I would have to say that the Lululemon example is very much in the minority. This is what is done in the business sector is remarkably superficial still. But this is, I think that this is the opportunity, right, is to help organizations like that to better understand how to be philanthropic from the perspective of the people who are requiring support. And the other important part of this is corporations, of many of whom have corporate foundations, and the corporate foundations typically are, are not operating in the way that other private foundations might. They're just kind of mirroring the corporate priorities of the organizations that they're associated with. Again, but another problem and a huge opportunity.
Anyone else? Mo, why don't you throw another question? How much time do we have left? We have 25 minutes, and we don't have to go the full time. But
Actually, I do have something to add on to this, because this is, since I am new to philanthropy, one of the first questions I asked walking in was, what's the typical philanthropic business model, and what is it that CRA regulation says that we can actually do? And I actually saw a chasm between the two, in the sense that I saw that CRA regulation actually lets you do a whole lot of stuff that the traditional philanthropic business model didn't necessarily do. And once we actually dove into CRA regulation and just started asking questions about, like, okay, how do we play within, like, what we could, like, if we didn't want to change a single law or regulation right now, what is it that we can do? We actually learned we can do a whole lot. It requires effort to, like, navigate the waters, and like you said, Chris, like, there's so many people doing so many innovative things like that, are figuring out how to navigate these waters, but there's a lot of stuff that we can do. But then the big question for us is, like, okay, how is it that, and this is like my own, like, personal reflection, walking into this sector, is kind of like understanding how different people are engaging with it and meeting them where they're at, in the sense that, so just as an aside, this morning, as I was explaining our approach to another leader in philanthropy, he just asked me straight up, he's like, why are you even a philanthropy foundation? Like, why, like, just based on our approach, why did you register? And I was like, well, you know what? I was like, from CRA regulation, it actually directly fits into some of the things that we want to do. But he was framing it more as, like, what he saw as being usual philanthropic foundation business model. And the reason I get excited about that is because I find that there's a lot of creativity that's being done, and still a lot more that needs to be done in the granting space. But I 100% agree with you, Chris, that the DQ discussion for ourselves is actually not, and that's just our approach, is not a discussion for that we pay attention to, because our approach is, how do we get 100% of our capital to deliver impact? And that kind of yields this whole other thing, where we kind of look at us as not just being a granting foundation, but how is it that we do equity investments? How is it that we offer loans at below market rates? And the one thing that we found is foundations, from a regulatory perspective, are in this very interesting space that, for example, and I have to learn more about this, so don't quote me on it, but even when you look at, like, program related investments, where foundations have to, like, the disbursement quota being 3.5%, how I interpret that is that if we make an investment that is related to the social impact that we want to see in the world, it can have a 3.5% concession, and we can just eat that, and you call it a grant. And because then the next thing people tell us is, like, oh, well, you know, these social impact investments perform at a lower rate than other ones. And so we've been, like, exploring all these tools that are available to us in how the system is currently designed. And I'd also say that's because we're, like, I'm new to this, so I don't even, like, still going down the road of how to redesign it, but, like, understanding, like, all the ways that we can play in the sandbox with what's available to us.
Sorry, Chris, did you want to say something before, or somebody wants to say something before I ask a question? Yeah.
So we as a foundation actually we do a couple of interesting things from a standpoint of what we do with our endowment fund, right? So we do look at organizations and investing in those organizations through an endowment fund. For instance, university research that's coming out of university, we invest in that. As through our endowment, a small amount, because it aligns with what we're trying to do and solve, right? We also do things like, we recently started up the Alberta Windmill Fund, So we essentially donated $200,000. We've got a matching call out for that $200,000 to create a fund in Alberta that provides immigrants the ability to access and get low interest loans to be able to recertify into the areas that they were originally trained to do. So for instance, a doctor comes over from South Africa, is not able to practice as a doctor here because he doesn't have the certification yet, can't afford to get the certification because he's got to work to support a family. The Windmill provides a loan to that doctor to be able to recertify and be able to survive while doing that. And then that doctor pays the loan back. It's low interest. We don't benefit from that. We've actually started the fund for that loan, which will turn over in perpetuity as it gets paid back. Other people will be accessing that fund. So far to date, in Alberta, I believe in the first month that that's existed, there's been 16 people that have been able to access that loan ability. So we do look at different ways of sort of using our dollars to not just sort of give an organization money, but innovative ways to make it work better. And also from endowment standpoint, we look at investing in ways. We also look at pulling partnerships together. For instance, we've got a current partnership between a new technology that's a medical technology and a foundation that invests into neurological studies. So they're studying gut health and how it affects neurology, and a university professor that wants to create a gut biome bank that this new technology can be used for. So we've managed to pull these three areas together, one a nonprofit, one a university professor, and one a new technology that's just been launched, and been able to support all three of those in the same space to work together for a common goal. So it's interesting. You can do some pretty innovative things through your foundation, for sure.
Thank you, Mona. I think that was sort of the direction I wanted to go in for my next question about creativity, pulling off of the last two comments. Creativity and innovation and partnership, I think, are really important. And of course, we pride ourselves on really looking for partnerships, co-design, co-production, working with, change makers, quote unquote, influencers, within the social sector, in different ways. And one of the things that I think about a lot and think back on to my time when I worked in the space of Indigenous funding, and at a time, there was a time within Calgary and across the country through the Urban Aboriginal Strategy and work where we had a collaborative granting process. And it was a super unique and innovative thing at the time. And this is like, what, Chris, like 15 years ago or something ridiculous, like a long time ago. And we had participation from the federal government, the provincial government, the municipal government, as well as foundations in Calgary working together to support the funding of Indigenous programming within Calgary. It sort of started around here in Calgary and sort of broadened across the country through the Urban Aboriginal Strategy with the federal government at the time. And we were able to leverage millions of dollars because of that, knowing that the disparate amounts of money that each levels of government in each place puts into Indigenous funding and programming within cities. And we know that every one of them had their own mandates and they had their own guidelines and they had all those own things. We were able to develop a process by which we had one sort of intake, one sort of forum, and it was dominated by community leaders who sat at tables in each of the areas to say, we work in the social service sector, we work in education, we work in employment that support our people within these communities. We'll set the community priorities, and we'll say these are the things that we know that we need, that elders have given information on, that youth has given information on, that community has given information on, community-led priority making. And then we invited them to come in and give their ideas to one forum. We invited them to present orally to the committees, and then the community leaders of volunteers. And it was months-long processes. Like a big part of our work that we did at the Calgary Urban Aboriginal Initiative was doing this and having those volunteers rank those proposals on one side that thing and say, this is what we think is the most important value in the community based on a number of factors. All the processes and frameworks were built to do that. And then we presented those to the funders, got all those funders in one table and said, here's what the community wants, here's what they need, and here's our recommendations, their recommendations to how they should fund. And then each of those funders went through and said, okay, yep, I can take this, I can take that, I got this. You know, they had actual agreements, even at the federal level, like lateral agreements to like get funding pieces done from different departments. Like it was so unique and unbelievably innovative and way ahead of its time. And then governments change. And then something loses. And once the feds are out, the province is out, the city is out, the foundations are out, like everyone drops. And so it wasn't sustainable to the fact that nobody took it up afterwards. And it's been a huge loss, I think, not just in Calgary, but across the country. And the Indigenous piece is just one of those, you know, equity seeking groups that, you know, that model could work for. So I guess my question, knowing that there is old ways of doing, there are new ways of doing, there are also really innovative ways and creative ways of looking at partnerships. And our hope for bringing a group of you together is to say, you know, what do we do next and how can we, and what would make sense for a group? And I know that they're probably like foundation associations and all of these pieces that bring, you know, people together, but sometimes when you start too big, it's too difficult. And how can we work together, and what things do you think we could collaborate on that's innovative to think about how do we pool all of these wonderful ideas, conversations, thoughts that we've been mulling about today and put them into some sort of action, knowing that somebody has to take leadership. But I don't know, maybe I'm just thinking out loud here, just based on, this wasn't a question from the thing and I'm totally jumping out of play, but I just thought about that experience and how impactful that was from community, so that organizations felt they were heard, community felt they were heard, the funders were all on board. Like it was such a special time. How do we get back to that together collectively?
I'm thinking about something. So you probably heard like the saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think about how, and I'll kind of tweak that to say people and culture eat strategy and outcomes for breakfast. So as much as we as a foundation can kind of talk a lot about outcomes and strategy, all that kind of stuff, we know that this is a people sport. And how is it that we kind of understand, and from our perspective is like have like radical empathy for all these people that are operating in the system that we're trying to play in. It really came about, well, one of the big points that came up was one of the groups that we're working with is the Raven Capital Foundation and their diabetes mitigation project in Southern Manitoba and PEI, where they kind of went in, did the work, and they found out that Indigenous people in these communities, once they are diagnosed with diabetes, their lifetime cost to the healthcare system is about $200,000. And this is the community kind of brought them in and said, like, how is it that we can improve the health of our communities? So basically you have this centralized payer of the outcomes, the health authority, that's currently so-called paying for that problem. And they are saying, you know what, we know that there's ways that we can reduce diabetes in the community. We just need support in doing it. And they're saying, we don't even need the money up front. We can actually get the money from elsewhere. And they're basically creating a community-led social impact bond. But the thing that, I love Jeff, he's on our advisory committee. Jeff Sear from Raven Capital. I was like, I'd have this conversation with him where he's like, you know what, it would take us years to figure out how to get the government or the centralized authority to actually pay for the outcome for not new money, but pay to save money, like actually like distribute that savings piece. And when we actually boiled it down to the people element, the Canadian Labour Congress recently released a report. So Canadian Labour Congress, primarily made of labor unions and social workers in Canada, that was advocating very heavily against social finance, social impact bonds, and everything else. Because they're basically saying it results in reduced taxes, reduced public services, reduced quality, private sector coming in saying we can do it better, and in their words, private capital making profit off of social misery. But if you take a step back from it, you realize that social welfare in Canada is already very financialized. There's people, including myself, I have a livelihood in this space. How do we think about and I lived in Alberta for like 8 years doing energy climate change work, and everyone speaks about the just transition for people in the oil and gas sector. I think about what's the just transition look like for people in the social development sector who are working on things that might not necessarily be working, where there's lots of money being spent on things that may not be producing the best results. But at the end of the day, it's a people sport. There's people in those positions and those jobs. What does their trajectory look like? And that's something that I think a lot about as a next step.
We have 10 minutes left. I would love to give the floor each one of our panelists. You can respond to Mo's question or build on anything we've heard today.
Thanks. I have a couple of quick thoughts here. One is that for folks who have capital and are looking to invest it in what I would consider some of the most bold work that's happening in this country right now, is to invest in the endowment building for Indigenous-led community foundations. There's a handful. I just had a fantastic conversation with Udlu Hansen, who's building one in the Arctic in Iqaluit, and there are more and more. So if you want to fund work that is being led by the communities who are most deeply impacted by the social and the systemic wide policies that cause harm to their communities, then invest in their endowment building, invest in supporting them to build the infrastructure to be strong, community grant makers. We're happy to share our list of organizations who do that work. Another way that Settler Philanthropy can get involved is to provide dollars to pooled funds, Indigenous-led pooled funds. There's a ton of them out there, and more of them need investment by folks who are like, here's $250,000 or $500,000. We might sit over here and learn a bit about why it's important to allow Indigenous people to have direct decision making over these pooled funds to communities and organizations they have expertise in. But ultimately, supporting pooled funds is another way to both be a learner as a philanthropist in the space, but to support equity-seeking communities. And there are pooled funds for any other equity-seeking community that you might have a particular interest in. And then additionally, in addition to supporting the investment in Indigenous community foundations, if you want to move your capital and support endowment building, you should also be paying attention to the great work of the Foundation for Black Communities. They're doing amazing, brilliant grant-making work. They've been doing a campaign nationally to help build up an awareness of their realities. They have also recognized that in community foundations, I think it's like less than 7 cents on a dollar or 70 cents on a dollar goes to Black-led organizations across this country. And so these are issues that could very easily be rectified if they're given the investment. So I think in part it requires the folks in the space to recognize that rather than trying to do it yourself, there are probably, Black-led, Indigenous-led, racialized-led, queer-led, trans-led, women-led organizations already doing the work, and they don't need a new fancy social innovation program to work through. They just need a deep, huge, and abundant investment in their organizations to do their good work. And then you'll see all kinds of important transformation and impacts happen. Because I do think there's a fine line between folks coming into the sector from business, thinking that they've got the answers. But if business is about driving capital and not paying enough attention to people in the way that Atif that you're talking about, then you have really harmful impacts. So I think it's important that we're like consistently having a conversation about mitigating against that potential risk. And at the end of the day, one of the things I advocate for over and over is what is called My God dollars. So this is multi-year general operating dollars. This acronym comes from Vu Lee of nonprofit AF. He is fantastic. I wish he was like a cousin of mine. And he talks about the importance of providing an opportunity for organizations to build general operating dollars so that they can actually be wise and strategic in their work. I don't need a bunch of funders telling me about how I need to meet their strategic goals. I need the money so I can meet my own strategic goals. And that's the kind of outcome we want for all Indigenous organizations and other equity-seeking groups. And I think it's very possible and very simple. Write the checks, get out of the way.
Mona, Paul, closing words from you guys.
Mona?
Well, I think from a foundation standpoint, I mean, we really do want to collaborate more. We want to understand the spaces we're working in, have a good sense of really the changes we want to make, or the organizations we want to work with. Mental health is a great example of that, how we've pulled together a lot of collaboration with people across Canada and specifically Alberta to really understand what we're trying to accomplish in that. And where we're going with that is really a systematic change. It was interesting, the discussion about government, because one of our biggest concerns is that we make some changes in this space and then government changes and that those changes are negated, right, or not happening any longer. So we're really trying to look at affecting a policy, but also understanding why existing policy is there to begin with, right? So again, from our standpoint, we really like to understand the spaces we're working in. We really like to have a sense of and it's changed. That's changed massively. We used to be the foundation that used to just write checks and then hand them over, and that was the end of it. We also like to leverage some of our experiences and some of our expertise. For instance, the entrepreneurial space that we've been working in for the last 10 years. We have that background, we have that experience as a family, and so we are involved with the University of Calgary in creating those. Not involved in what they do, but involved in sort of the funding of it, but also the management of it from a higher level, right? We don't tell them how to teach their courses. We don't tell them what to do that way, but we certainly are involved as advisors in that space. I think it's really important to be data driven in some way as well. That's just us. We're also really like to be able to work with organizations where they can leverage our funds. For instance, if we provide funds, they can leverage it to raise additional funds through either government grantings or other family foundations that will come in on top of that. We are in the process too of collaborating with other foundations that want to work in the same space so that we can have a clearer focus as a group of funders that perhaps could do better work because we could provide more funds into areas that we're all curious about. So those are just some of the thoughts I guess I have. So thank you for inviting me to participate in this. I've gotten a lot of interesting thoughts and I just really appreciate everyone sharing their experiences and their thoughts as well.
Thanks, Mona. Paul?
Thanks.
Yeah, I just I echo what you just said, Mona. I've listened a lot and listening to everybody here, and I guess what's in my mind, a couple things that that are my own takeaways, which I think has seen us, thinking about for a while, but reinforced today is, I guess number one, the whole importance of involving people with lived experience all the way through this, so people with lived experience, making investment philanthropic decisions, people who lived experience developing programs, and people with lived experience actually evaluating the performance of programs. So that's number one. And I think, again, from the point of view of where I come from, which is mostly in the corporate sector, this is done almost not at all, I would say. The other thing I've just been thinking about is listening to everybody is how capital is used for the purpose of social change. I think we all should be agnostic. It doesn't really matter. The main thing is the outcomes of it. So if it's philanthropic capital, investment capital, blended opportunities, which are increasingly, common. So it's a philanthropic gift that's combined with an investment opportunity. It's all good. And and the final thing I guess I think about, I'm kind of a speed freak, and so I like to take action, you know. And so I would say all these things are true as long as it doesn't get in the way of moving fast. And you know, some would say that you know, this is, and which is basically innovation, you know, what are the fastest ways to make change at the lowest cost? That's how I, you know, such something that I always keep in mind, and I was thinking about when everyone was talking about here. So thank you.
I can confirm after working for Paul for many years, he is obsessed with fast, intentional, fast, and right. Thanks, Paul. Mo?
Yeah, I think just thank you so much to everybody for coming today and for being a part of the conversation. I think we have some interesting thoughts, and we'll collect all of the notes as well as sort of what we found, like some threads to pull together to share with everybody, and come back with, you know, perhaps some next sort of action steps that could be meaningful, that we think where we could potentially support some gathering and continued conversation to then move into something hopefully actionable. We have some ideas on sort of capacity building, some knowledge mobilization, perhaps conversations about integration with funders in general, not just with foundations. And so I think there's definitely some building blocks that we can support, and just appreciate the willingness to participate in the conversation, to be frank and transparent and honest. And I would say just look forward to hearing from us, and hope that we can count on all of you to sort of to support where appropriate and where you can. We will send the deck of information for you. And if there's anything else, we have the circles information. If there's anything else you wanted to share out with the group to start, that would be great.
Thanks so much, everyone. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Loved the not webinar approach, conversation approach.
Have a great
Thank you, everyone.
take
Bye.
care. Bye.
Thank you.